term groomer just refers to the sexualization of children, those who perpetrate it and those who enable it. And it's controversial because it's true. This is a point that I make in my piece, is that it seems like nothing is so controversial as the truth these days. That's just the thing that you're not supposed to ever say, the right thing. So they're using your money to encourage states to basically create these systems that allow, I mean, look, if you don't think that these things are going to be politicized, then you haven't been paying attention to what the FBI is doing, to what the DOJ is doing. You haven't been paying attention to the January 6th committee. Red flag laws will absolutely be politicized. Apart from any violence that may or may not happen, people are simply angry at Biden and the Democrats by the way they're governing, right?
Okay.
It just seems like they're deliberately making the lives of millions of people intolerable. This is really something like ideology, which is ideology cannot be reckoned with by reason. Like, you can't try to approach an ideology rationally because it's essentially insulated from reason. So what seem like inconsistencies and hypocrisies to us are actually not so to people that really believe in these things.
Welcome to the State of Affairs in partnership with Serbian Radio Chicago. We are having conversations that matter. And my guest today is Pedro Gonzalez. He is the associate editor of Chronicles, the magazine of American culture. Pedro, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's good to be here.
Great to have you today. And I feel there's a lot to unpack. And actually, you have just published, I have to say, a very disturbing op-ed for Newsweek. And I think both you and I and so many parents around the country are affected by this because we have young children who are in schools. And in this opinion piece, you say, whether we say it or not, our culture provides cover for groomers. Now, what is so problematic about, first of all, saying groomers? And second of all, if you don't mind, lay out the case for me in this very, very disturbing case that you yourself uncovered.
So really, the term groomer just refers to the sexualization of children, those who perpetrate it and those who enable it. And it's controversial because it's true. This is a point that I make in my piece, is that it seems like nothing is so controversial as the truth these days. That's just the thing that you're not supposed to ever say, the right thing. And that's the irony of the term groomer. And in particular, in this piece, I talk about two teachers. There's actually three people in the piece, but one is not named. I just write him in as an accomplice for the reasons of space. But the focus is on two teachers, one in Philadelphia and one in Hawaii. The teacher in Philadelphia works at a prestigious private school, and the teacher in Hawaii worked at a variety of different schools. And in this case, this school on the island of Oahu was called Pearl City High School. Mm-hmm. So basically, investigators were tipped off that the teacher in Philadelphia had allegedly uploaded child pornography to Dropbox. And when they started to look into that teacher, they noticed that he had been exchanging messages with a bunch of people online that the prosecutors described as a network of like-minded child predators who were creating and distributing child pornography. And one of the people that investigators noted as they were sifting through this person's digital interactions claimed to be a teacher in a different state. And so when they looked into this, they found that this was a teacher at Hawaii that I mentioned, that he was confronted while working on campus as a summer school teacher by federal agents. And during an interview, he admitted fluidly, almost like he was just sort of so stunned that he just confessed what he'd been up to. And he said in particular that he had sexual interactions with one former student who he knew was a minor at the time, 13 years old, that he had recorded it. It almost sounded like he had a studio. He said that he used camera equipment to record what they were doing. And but this stuff also happened on campus, because he said that him and the student would have sex, they're both male, during lunch breaks. And he would create child pornography of what they were doing. And then he sent it to this teacher in Philadelphia. and also as part of this broader network. And so both of these people right now are in the legal system. But the really disturbing part of this, on the one hand, is the fact that these people are part of a larger network. They're not the only two. Like I said, there's a third person, but that third person is not the end of the road here. And on the other hand, in particular, the teacher in Hawaii had been publicly outspoken against the use of the term groomer. He accused people of using the term groomer of actually being closeted pedophiles, that only a groomer himself would ever use such a term to kind of distract people from their own secret misdeeds. He was outspoken against Florida's parental rights and education bill. He said that only pedophiles would want to keep children ignorant about sex and gender because that would make them vulnerable to being preyed upon, that their naivety would make them easy targets for pedophiles. And he accused conservatives of projecting their own pedophilia onto people like him. He was saying all of this stuff at the same time that he was creating and distributing child pornography with his own students. And the teacher in Philadelphia was doing the same thing. He pretended to be a teenage girl online to bait his own high school and middle school students into sending him nude videos that he would circulate in this network. And they're mostly male students, by the way. And he actually, in a message, talked about how he was going to use Google Docs to kind of organize all of the content that he was making because he was getting so much of it. Like it just like a Excel spreadsheet for sixth graders and so on and stuff like that. I mean, and everything that I wrote, by the way, and everything I just said, it's just the surface. This story is actually much more horrible. I'm going to follow up with a much longer story. In particular, I want to allow people to see what these people are saying about their students in their own words, which, I mean, Newsweek, to their credit, published this, but there are things that Newsweek wouldn't publish, and I wouldn't expect them to, that are just because they're so grotesque. But I think those things need, like, parents need to see that stuff. So I'm not done with this story.
So the parents have been in the center, it seems, lately of even certain elections, because obviously there is a lot going on in our schools that the parents finally are realizing that the children are not only being sexualized in schools, they are also being indoctrinated by CRT and Antifa and Black Lives Matter and all sorts of things, that we have a constant pressure on our young generations through this social engineering. But in particular, there's all of this transgender ideology that is being pushed onto our youngest, even in starting at 3 years old. Obviously, you mentioned what is happening in Florida, and our really, I have to say, courageous Governor Ron DeSantis, who is standing up to not just this in schools, but also to Disney and various organizations that are weaponizing this against our children. But I'd like to ask you, obviously, you are a parent of a boy and a girl, little girl. I'm a parent of 2 boys. In all of your research, who do you think is more susceptible to this? Because as a parent, I look into it as well. Is it more targeted towards girls or boys? Or I guess it depends how we break down some of these cases.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I do know that it seems like young girls are really vulnerable to this stuff because there's this way that these things spread. And it has 2 different names that are similar, but they refer to slightly different things. So social contagion and peer contagion. And basically that there are behaviors that children get from interactions with their peers and interactions with their surroundings, which includes social media. And so a scholar published an article not so long ago in, I think, a journal called PLOS ONE. And in this article, she argued that many parents who are dealing with transgender kids notice that before their kids, particularly girls, decide that they're trans, that they are interacting heavily with social media, and that their peers also basically experience confusion with their gender. And then under those conditions, so their peers are talking about, gender dysphoria or transgenderism, whatever, and their kids are interacting heavily with social media, that those things will usually precede what this author calls rapid onset gender dysphoria. And it was really controversial to some people, because basically she was saying this is kind of spreading in the way that like anorexia spreads.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually, I think, a really useful way to understand this is that, I mean, because anorexia is established, right?
Yes.
It's just everyone understands that like peer pressure, social demands, whatever, will basically create this kind of feedback loops where certain circles of girls will kind of will
Flock
engage,
to.
yeah, and engage in these unhealthy habits, right? In particular, with the case of anorexia, eating disorders,
Mm-hmm.
in order to avoid being bullied for their weight or whatever. I mean, you name it. Like they see something on TV and they think that that's what they have to look like, and their peers kind of also look a certain way. But basically, there's no question that anorexia spreads through basically peer and social interactions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what this author was arguing, that in the same way that anorexia jumps from girl to girl and is reinforced by social media, gender dysphoria seems to be functioning the same way. And
that is interesting. And the reason why I asked you is because I seem to notice, I've been around schools, I thought in different schools, and I see the same thing. And it seems that boys also mature a little bit later, and they don't go seeking out these particular issues. Girls are more susceptible to watching, for example, MTV or VH1, because the days of MTV that we grew up with are clearly very different than what we see today. And even the Disney shows and things like that, girls are really looking into even the celebrities and the magazines, and boys are really not interested yet. Yes. Although they are affected by this in different ways, I would say. So there's something to be said about how children are being groomed based on their own gender, whether they are a girl or a boy, and at what point. But another thing I wanted to ask you, and you've made comments on this particular subject, is where did we really go wrong as a society that we are at this point today, where we are arguing what, or trying to figure out, for some people it is an unknown, including members of the Biden administration, what is a woman? They cannot seem to define what is a woman, or even what is a man for that matter. And we are now talking about the fact that men can get pregnant, and a range of things that just seem so ludicrous. Yeah. Where have we gone wrong?
I don't think I could tell you what the pinpoint origin of this is, but I think it's interesting that it's not clear to me that these people always believe or are consistent with their beliefs, you know, because on the one hand, men can have children, and therefore there is no real thing as sex and gender. These things are just kind of social constructs, right? But on the other hand, we celebrate every time a woman is appointed to some position in the Biden administration because she's a woman. So we actually know what women are. The Biden administration knows what women are because, for example, some woman who is Native American was recently appointed to a position. And again, that was heralded as a big victory for women, right? Particularly Native American women. If these people didn't know what women actually were, then they wouldn't be celebrating that. So I think this is really something like ideology, which is, ideology cannot be reckoned with by reason. Like, you can't try to approach an ideology rationally because it's essentially insulated from reason. So what seem like inconsistencies and hypocrisies to us are actually not so to people that really believe in these things. And so I think that tells you what we're dealing with. But in terms of the cause and how we got here, I mean, I think there are so many different, I guess,
milestones that we have crossed.
Yeah. But I think something that comes to mind is that maybe the people that should have been responsible for stewarding our culture in the right way kind of abandoned that. And so something that's relevant is right now the Supreme Court just overturned Roe v. Wade. Functionally, this just sends abortion back to the states. It doesn't ban abortion. So, and there's a good chance that there's going to be like a surge in abortions, by the way, of people feeling that they need to get, they need to basically flock to do, it'll become like a form of protest to get an abortion. So it doesn't actually stop abortions, but you're going to see the left, liberals, become enraged. Like, we're probably going to see violence against perceived conservative and religious targets in the United States as a result of this, because symbolically, what it suggests is that there is a competing value system in the United States opposed to the left's value system that is ascendant. And basically, for the longest time, only the left, only the liberals have been the ones who can basically, they're the only ones who have been allowed to be kind of activists, right? The rest of us have to be neutral. We're not allowed to say that there is a correct and a wrong way to live. We have to be neutral. But they have been able to positively kind of force their view on us. And we've convinced ourselves that, well, we're the good guys because we're neutral. I think that's completely wrong. I think it's impossible to have viewpoint neutrality in a healthy society. And so I think that that is somehow related to how we got here. The responsible people, the people that should have been steering us away from this stuff, just kind of acquiesced to it and decided that, well, we have to be neutral. Even if that side is kind of forcing their way of life on us, it's important that we remain neutral, which is a complete lie.
So that brings me to kind of a hot subject, and you just brought up the case in the Supreme Court. So it affects the abortion, but see, a liberal activists try to compare that to what just went on with our Second Amendment, and trying to kind of give this parallel between the two. But what actually separates the two is open up the Constitution. Is the abortion mentioned in the Constitution ever? Right. Versus, is the Second Amendment a constitutional right? And that should end all of the debate, but apparently it doesn't. But to your point, those who should have been responsible to preserve or conserve, what have they conserved lately? So let's talk about some of this, I'd call it treachery, that's actually happening within the GOP and the conservative movement in general. Are we being, I guess, left standing out in the open, and there are traitors amongst us who clearly are running their own show, and they're walking away from what the base really believes?
Yeah, well, I think this is really interesting because the GOP in particular, like Mitch McConnell, has always told people to basically vote for me because at least you'll get judges out of this, right? Vote for me because you'll get judges. We'll give you judges. We'll give you judges. But it seems like, ironically, the Supreme Court right now is doing things that make the Republican Party extremely uncomfortable, or at least look very bad. On the same day that the Supreme Court struck down this law in New York State that it required proper cause for getting a concealed carry permit. That law was struck down. Alito said that that law did not prevent the Buffalo shooting, which the liberals in the court cited as basically as a reason for why we need this kind of stuff. And Alito said, right, well, it didn't stop a really recent mass shooting. So and also Clarence Thomas says that like our laws need to be consistent basically with our principles. Like you said, looking back to the Constitution and things like that, looking to the Second Amendment, the history of it, things like that. Basically, so on the same day that happened, though, the GOP advanced gun control legislation, the first substantial piece of federal gun control in decades. And in particular, it's going to incentivize states to enact red flag laws. So they're using your money to encourage states to basically create these systems that allow, I mean, look, if you don't think that these things are going to be politicized, then you haven't been paying attention to what the FBI is doing, to what the DOJ is doing. You haven't been paying attention to the January 6th committee. Red flag laws will absolutely be politicized. Eric Swalwell, this Democrat politician, has pretty much said this on Twitter, that basically like people that he considers extremists would be disarmed under red flag law.
So they can apply it to pretty much anybody. It's
I'm
going to
telling
be
you
a
that.
political witch hunt. They don't like your opinion, they can flag you for anything.
Yeah. And that happened. The GOP was patting itself on the back about advancing gun control on the same day that the Supreme Court struck down that law in New York. And then abortion too. I mean, I think that comes as a shock for a lot of Republican politicians who pay lip service to abortion, but actually don't really want to do anything on the issue because it's a social issue. It's extremely controversial. So you take donations from people by talking about abortion, but then you never actually do anything about it. And now that the Supreme Court has done this on Roe, I think it actually makes a lot of Republicans kind of uncomfortable.
Yes. And you seem to be projecting that there may be violence if it comes to this, and particularly we may have another violent summer. Is this deliberate? Because obviously we have an election in November. Can this affect the election? And are we even going to have one? Because I've heard little rumors and people are afraid that there's going to be not just violence, but possibly another pandemic, or who knows what's going to take place between now and November, that it seems that the Democrats are aware that we are headed for this red wave, although I don't know if it helps based on what you're saying. Having a red wave of Republicans who will not do anything is not helping our cause. But can it affect what we see in November?
Yeah, I think right now we're doing something like riding the tiger, where there is a reaction that's brewing among people who identify with the Republican Party, but are obviously not represented by guys like Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy. The GOP doesn't really know what to do with them. It's trying, I mean, obviously there will be something, I think, like a red wave, especially now, but at the same time, the Republican base has never been angrier with its own party. And on the other hand, Democrats are doing a terrible job and they're governing badly. So a summer of protesting, a summer of riots would only worsen the chances of Democrats. It would only make Biden look worse and stuff like that. So it's interesting because it's like both parties, I think, are in a position where they're kind of maybe losing control of their constituents, if that makes sense. You know, if the social base of the Democratic Party starts burning places, like, you know, buildings down this summer over Roe, is that going to help or hurt the Democratic Party? But on the other hand,
well, but if we look at some of these organizations and people out on the streets willing to burn our cities down, we perceive them as an extended hand of the Democratic Party. And if the Democratic Party really has them under control, then to your point, they will probably calculate whether this is good or not for them.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. But I'm of the position that I think the Democratic Party is in a really difficult position because people are, apart from any, you know, violence that may or may not happen, people are simply angry at Biden and the Democrats by the way they're governing, right? It just seems like they're deliberately making the lives of millions of people intolerable. So that's why a red wave seems to be inevitable. But like I said, on the other hand, you know, what will the red wave bring us? A Republican Party that doesn't really seem to understand. I mean, look, John Cornyn, who's one of these Republicans who is patting himself on the back over gun control, got booed in Texas, in his home state. But then he goes on after he gets booed and he talks to Democrats and he tells them, because he thinks no one's listening, first we did guns, next we're going to do immigration. He's talking about amnesty. Because he thinks no one's listening. This is the incredible disconnect between the Republican Party and its base at this point.
So that's interesting. Obviously, there's a civil war going on within the conservative movement, but to your point, there seems to be a little bit of a civil war within the Democrat ranks, although we consistently perceive them as more homogenous, right? They're more united around their goals, where on the other side, there's actually a lot of different voices and much more freedom to have a dissenting voice. And are the American voters going to be able to consolidate on this particular anger, on the fact that now the Democrat base is also being afflicted by this? They're paying a lot of money at the gas pump. there's less and less food in grocery stores. I don't know if people are noticing. We obviously had a baby formula shortage. You have a baby yourself. So, I mean, these are all the things that are afflicting everyday people. It shouldn't be about Democrat or Republican any longer.
Yeah.
Everybody is suffering the same fate. And what I also find interesting, and maybe you can shed some light on this, I don't know how accurate it is, but in the past 15 months, people started creating lists of food processing factories and plants that have miraculously burned down or have disappeared, or now there's cows that are dying from heat exhaustion in Kansas. Is this not just food shortage, but this entire upheaval, economic upheaval, been deliberate? And for what purpose?
I have no idea if it's deliberate, but I think the fact that people think it's deliberate tells you how little confidence and trust Americans have in their own government. The fact that people are speculating whether or not this is the kind of controlled demolition of the US food chain tells you, I mean, in a healthy society, people would not think that. Certainly not so many people would think that, right? It just wouldn't occur to people if they lived in a society where they did not think the people who are in charge hate them. And I think that's the most important aspect of this, is it shows you that there is very little trust in our institutions. And I mean, that is a recipe for some pretty serious unrest. I mean, I think the United States right now is a little bit like Spain on the eve of the Civil War. You know, with, I think that's, I don't mean to say that we're going to have a civil war, but I mean, the level of polarization, it's real, you know, and you're saying that the issue is not Republican or Democrat. I think that's true. I think there will be absolutely people that voted for Biden who are going to vote for the Republican, you know, when the time comes. But on the other hand, it's actually shocking to see how many Democrats are really committed to this. Like, they're willing to pay $5, $7, $9 at the pump for democracy. You know, they're willing.
But for democracy of what?
Right.
And of whom?
Yeah. But you see this, you know, or they're willing to go through another lockdown. You know, they're actually fine with all of this stuff. And they'll actually talk to people like us and say that we're the rubes, you know, we're responsible for people dying, you know, that we care more about cheap gas than we do about democracy. I mean, we are, I think, really in uncharted waters when it comes to polarization.
Well, here we are in Florida, and I will tell you that no masks and no lockdowns almost, and we're still alive and we're functioning. Unlike most states, I would say Florida has really gained in these past couple of years. But interesting, you bring up now where we are headed, 2022, obviously November, and 24. But I'd like to go back to 2016 and then 2020. And you've obviously followed this closely and commented often on President Trump. And if you could break it down for me, what you see in terms of President Trump or candidate Trump prior to 2016, then President Trump, and then obviously post-presidency. Have you seen a shift and a change?
Well, I think that up until now, it seems like Trump's support base has been kind of shifting toward Ron DeSantis. That's not to say that they're, you know, abandoning Trump, but it's more of like, well, you know, Trump is getting old. He seems to be making bad judgment calls when it comes to endorsements, for example. And Ron DeSantis is kind of in the limelight right now. There are people that are, especially in particular liberals, who are saying that Ron DeSantis is like a more dangerous version of Trump because he seems to be more competent when it comes to wielding power. But I think that maybe these two recent Supreme Court decisions are going to maybe swing favor, or at least boost Trump's popularity as a potential candidate for 2024, because people are saying like this, you know, this is going to become Trump's legacy, this Supreme Court. that has issued this stuff. But in terms of like what Trump, the president, again, would look like, I'm not sure. I mean, the issue with Trump originally was that he was surrounded by bad personnel. I mean, you look at a lot of former Trump administration officials, and just frankly speaking, they're all bad people, like Jim Mattis, McMaster, John Bolton,
And they have
Pompeo.
all turned their back on him and really stabbed him in the back in a very public way.
Yeah, and I mean, and even after the administration, Trump continued to make bizarre choices, like Kevin McCarthy being on the chopping block. Well, what does he do? Trump endorses Kevin McCarthy, and then what does Kevin McCarthy do after Trump? Immediately after Trump endorses Kevin McCarthy goes and single-handedly saves Liz Cheney's career.
Yes.
At the same time that Liz Cheney's attacking Trump, and then later McCarthy much later, McCarthy finally disavows Cheney. But still, it's like the reason that Cheney is still around right now is because Kevin McCarthy saved her. And Kevin McCarthy did that after getting endorsed. I mean, it really, you think about it enough, like you go kind of crazy and you ask yourself, why is Trump doing this? I don't have an answer for it. But that is I think the valid concern of a second Trump administration is, has he learned from his mistakes when it comes to character judgment? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't think so. Because personnel is policy. Trump doesn't know. I mean, no one knows all of the different things that go on, right? I mean, you're president, you have to rely on your advisors.
Yes.
But the problem is that, again, Trump's advisors were people that did not believe in the America First agenda, even if Trump did. So Trump could tell them, do this for me or handle this. So then he's trusting that person to actually faithfully prosecute his duty as someone who represents the America First agenda, but that's not the case, right? So I think that's the primary concern with a second Trump administration.
And to that point, I can tell you personally, having worked internationally, particularly during the Trump administration, it did not reflect from top to bottom. Whatever his policies were, sometimes when you would travel to some of these different countries, it was the State Department, and then it trickles down into these career bureaucrats who are ambassadors in some of these countries, who are effectively running their own foreign policy that was completely detached from President Trump and even from Mike Pompeo at the time, because I had personal experience with this. They literally treat certain countries like their own protectorate. And it had nothing to do with what President Trump set out to do and with, as you said, America First policy. So that's a really good point. Although it seems that the Democrats, first of all, would like to exploit and possibly create a conflict between President Trump and Governor Ron DeSantis, because obviously they are the two most prominent names that are, at least for now, circulating around, and they have a great relationship. People are even toying with an idea of Trump DeSantis ticket. But then on the other hand, let's focus on the Democrats for a moment. Do you think they are ready to let President Biden down the drain, and he may not finish his term, but somehow not have Kamala Harris take over? Because this seems like a very dangerous thing for them as well.
Yeah, there was an article, I think, in the New York Times recently, and that was basically the thesis was that Biden wants to run again, but there are Democrat leaders who don't think that that's a good idea. So I think they're in a pickle, so to speak, right now, because the alternative is what? Kamala Harris. She's completely unlikable. She would get demolished by anybody because precisely because, I mean, the only reason she's VP is because she's a Black woman. That's it. She's just it was a token gesture, right?
Yes. Well, back to that point, they do know what a woman is because she checked all of the specific identity marks.
That's right. That's right. So no, I think Democrats are really in a strange place right now, where I mean, this is going back to the idea that liberals can't possibly continue supporting this. Well, Andrew Sullivan, who's this allegedly conservative, I just say that he's a liberal commentator, said that he was one of the many Americans who voted for Biden because they voted for Biden as a competent moderate.
Yes.
These people really thought Biden was going to be a competent moderate, and they're shocked by that he's both incompetent and not moderate. So yeah, I think I don't know what Democrat leadership is thinking, but because there is no obvious answer for this, right? Like, how do you solve this problem? I have no idea, and I think that's why in 2024 we're going to probably have a Republican administration, and this is why most of my attention has been paid to the dilemma of Ronald and Donald. And I mean, I like Ron DeSantis, but I don't really actually want him to run for president, because then Florida could lose a really good governor. And I think
Neither do we. We don't want to lose
right.
him.
Yeah, and the thing is that's actually, I would say, just as maybe almost more important right now is to have good governors, because good governors can protect you from what the federal
Yes.
government is doing.
Yes.
You know, they can basically turn the state into a little kingdom where, you know, the federal government decides that we have to lock down. Maybe Ron DeSantis doesn't want to lock down,
Yeah.
you know, or and so I think that's actually really important. And so it's a cost benefit here. Like, is it worth losing Ron DeSantis as a governor for him to run for the White House? When, I mean, name another good GOP governor. It's hard, right?
Well, everybody's talking about Texas there, but I think we're threading lightly on comparing Ron DeSantis and what he's done to Florida. And it is really free state of Florida, not just in terms of the United States, but even internationally.
Yeah.
We have functioned perfectly well this entire time and couldn't even grasp the concept of these other countries and states, how it felt to actually be locked down. I used to live in Chicago for 25 years. And is that a hell of a place to go back to,
Yeah.
given everything that's happening, including the crime rate and the shootings that are closer and closer for some people, even to the North Shore, and it's becoming very uncomfortable to the point that, I don't know if you caught this, Ken Griffin is moving his companies now down to Miami from Illinois. So again, thank you for the Democrats. But you made an interesting point, and I think somebody just out of Texas who won her congressional seat in a district that hasn't been Republican in 150 years, Myra Flores, 22 November, obviously, and then 24, Latino Americans seem to be playing a pivotal role for us in the culture of war, but also in this general political landscape.
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, it's nothing that the Republican Party has done, right? It's not because it's not because of some secret formula GOP has. It just seems like, I mean, if you look at approval ratings for Biden's approval ratings are the lowest among white men and Hispanics. I think it just seems like the people that are angriest with what the left, with what Democrats, with what Biden are doing are these two groups. And I mean, I've written about this. My take is that just Hispanics, that there's still a kind of healthy atavism, and I use that term positively, in Hispanics, where they appreciate strong leaders. They appreciate the things that, you know, U.S. society is actively trying to suppress, like healthy masculinity, machismo, a kind of vitalism, right? Or in Latin America, you would say that these are like the politics of caudillos, strong men. And I think, ironically, because there obviously is a dynamic here where a lot of Latinos and Hispanics, whatever you want to call them, they still vote in large numbers for the Democratic Party. But on the other hand, there is a sizable number of them who are rejecting all of this stuff, who are rejecting, you know, the transgender ideology that's coming for their children. They're rejecting the idea that we can just have spontaneous race riots, you know, and no one gets punished for it.
Yes.
It is really interesting because you're actually seeing this effort to kind of rope some Hispanics into the category of being white. And you saw, particularly during the BLM riots, where people were saying that, like, the Hispanic community has a white supremacy problem, and making this this incredible argument that the reason that Hispanics, I mean, it's not that incredible, but basically kind of saying, well, it's because Hispanics are assimilating into white culture, and that's why they're voting for Republicans. I don't know how much the truth to that is, but I do know that I am really happy to see that there's a kind of reaction in the Hispanic community that is rebelling against the Democratic Party, and more importantly, because this goes beyond the political, rebelling against the culture of the left. And I'm cautiously optimistic that they're going to, I never refer to the Hispanics as my community because I think of myself as an American first,
Sure.
but I'm cautiously optimistic that Hispanics will continue playing an important role and a positive role, and not just kind of being foot soldiers of the Democratic Party.
And that's an interesting point. And I would just add, at least from my personal experience and just a humble opinion, that it has nothing to do with necessarily assimilating into the whiteness, but traditionally the Hispanic communities are traditionalists, and they're religious, and they're family oriented, and they're hardworking. And that is the premise that this country was built upon. And that is what they appreciate. So I feel, as you said, it's not some magic that the GOP did. It is just an inherent need of some of these communities. And I would actually include Serbian Americans in that community, and many other communities that, yes, are Americans first and are Americans by choice, and have come here in several different waves over the course of decades, but understand what this nation offers to them and what it once stood for. Yeah. And this is what all of us are fighting for. And with that, I'd like to actually pivot a little bit into foreign policy. Recently, you were on Tucker Carlson. You were talking about Ukraine and what is happening in Europe overall right now. But you brought up something that many don't want to touch, although you didn't go way too deep into it, and I'd like to. You mentioned that the main culprit of what is happening today is NATO, but not NATO as of recent several years, NATO under the Clinton administration. Now, where I would like to go deeper is what actually happened with NATO under the Clintons, and why this is such an interesting subject for American Serbs, for example, and that entire South Central European nation or area of former Yugoslavia, because we were the direct victims, essentially, of the NATO expansion, because at a certain point when the Warsaw Pact collapsed, NATO was deemed unnecessary.
Yes.
So it needed to be reinvented. Yep. Please talk about that a little bit.
That's great. That's a great starting off point, because that's exactly what happened. That's basically what the Clinton administration does, is it reinvents NATO under a kind of humanitarian mission. And one of our, obviously the intervention that is on our mind here is the Kosovo War, which was, I mean, it flies in the face of international law. Hundreds of civilians are killed. I mean, this is why Hillary Clinton was mercilessly mocked when she's talking about how if the Russians don't want to be called war criminals, they shouldn't bomb Ukrainian hospitals. And people are reminding them that, you know, your husband led the NATO bombing campaign that bombed hospitals.
And she was very supportive of it. Actually, she was the one who pushed him overboard to decide to bomb.
And also the Chinese embassy. I mean, this is why when NATO demanded that China condemn Russia violating international law with its invasion of Ukraine, China's response was, we don't need to be lectured on breaking international law by the breakers of international law themselves. And we remember who bombed our embassy in Belgrade and killed 3 civilians with 5.
Well, we broke also, pardon me, but we broke our own law, because the NATO intervention happened not only against the UN Security Council, but there was no congressional approval for it.
That's right. Yeah, and it was, but that's precisely why the ideology of humanitarianism is so important, because it's above law. You're appealing to something higher than law, right? You're appealing to kind of something that is transcendent almost, and can kind of suspend law, because we need to do that to save lives. And I think that's actually why humanitarianism as an ideology is so dangerous, because you can justify, you know, overthrowing whatever government you want. See Libya. But I mean, I wrote about this also for Chronicles. So when we look at the outcome of that US intervention under Clinton, what happens? Well, Kosovo becomes a hotbed for Wahhabism. And when ISIS rises, which European country is sending some like the most per capita fighters to ISIS?
Outside of European Union, exactly. Thank you.
Kosovo. And all of this happened under the watchful eye of the United States government, and with the help of Saudi money and influence in Kosovo. And I mean, it's just it's incredible because again, what allowed ISIS to rise to power? Another U.S. intervention. It's just this endless cycle of interventions that actually make everything worse and then require future interventions by us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It just never ends. And the relevance of the U.S. intervention under Clinton to Ukraine and Russia is that for the Russians, that was a kind of traumatic moment. And specifically, Putin said that it impressed upon him the view that the United States would just do whatever it wanted, that it would just violate international law at will. And for him, it was extremely, it was a moment of him that kind of, I wouldn't call it a turning point, but it definitely kind of, it impressed something deeply negative on him about what the United States government was capable of doing. And obviously for Russians, because the relationship with Serbians was also deeply traumatic. But it also, I think the Libya intervention, also done under the banner of humanitarianism, that again for Russia was also another, I think, a serious turning point. But between Kosovo and Libya, you have a series of other things that happened. I mean, in 1998, going back to that time, you've got George Kennan, the leading exponent of U.S. Soviet containment policy, who's saying, look, the United States is turning its back on the people who staged the greatest bloodless revolution in modern history, the Russians. That our fight was never with the Russian people, it was with the communist regime. And by basically insisting on turning Russia into our permanent enemy, we're going to trigger a catastrophe in the future. I mean, from George Kennan in 98 all the way through the present, you've had people like Henry Kissinger himself saying that, and trying to force NATO incorporation in Ukraine and Georgia, it's going to trigger a crisis. And at every turn, these people have been ignored. And now suddenly, well, this whole conflict was inevitable. It's all Russia's fault. The United States government did nothing wrong. And if you disagree with any of this, you're now a Putin apologist. And I think that's why it's important to talk about what George Kennan said, what Henry Kissinger said, what Alexander Solzhenitsyn said in 2006, that NATO expansionism was creating a crisis in the West. It's just, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, there's too much to cover in one thing here, but I think it's important that so many prominent people, enemies of totalitarianism, were warning about this, and we ignored them.
And I think that is why American Serbs played a little bit of a pivotal role in 2020 and even in 2016. There is ample evidence that in 2016, districts where Serbs resided in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin flipped from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump, not because the community knew what they were getting into with Donald Trump, but they really knew what they were going to experience with Hillary Clinton. Yep. And interestingly enough, you bring up Henry Kissinger, and we look at Zbigniew Brzezinski and all of these architects of some of our foreign policy. But for example, somebody like Madeleine Albright, who actually not many people understand this, she grew up in Serbia. She was rescued by the Serbs with her father, who was a diplomat. They escaped to Serbia from Czechoslovakia at the time, from the Nazis. And there's that famous or infamous story of her not really knowing that she has Jewish roots. When the Serbs protected her, she grew up there. We fed her, we clothed her, and this is how she repaid us. It was, in fact, from what I understand, her and Sandy Berger and a variety of different individuals, including Hillary Clinton, who pushed Bill Clinton ultimately to bomb Serbia and create an enemy out of a country that has been allied with the United States through World War I, World War II, and beyond. So again, back to looking at what happened in the Balkans. And out of that, we started coining the term colored revolution and regime change. I know you know what that means precisely. And from that point on, I argue it was a blueprint for Libya, for Arab Spring, for many even nations in that former Soviet Union space. Comparing that to what took place here in the United States with President Trump, do you think we had an element, at least, of regime change and color revolution here?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of demystify the term, because when we talk about color revolutions, all we're talking about is basically social unrest that is aided by the state, essentially. That's it, right? And obviously,
or weaponized state agencies.
But that obviously the hand that's moving all this stuff is hidden from view. But I mean, the interesting thing about the United States is that people were saying this resembles stuff out of the color revolution playbook. In particular, Darren Beattie at Revolver News was saying that. And
speaking of him, there is a tweet I mentioned to everyone I speak to because it resonates so strongly with me. On January 10th, so after January 6th, everything's taking place. On January 10th, Darren Beattie tweets out 70 plus million Americans are essentially Serbs of 1990s.
Yep.
And that baffles me.
Yeah. So going back to that, so at the same time that people are saying this looks like color revolution, you've got color revolution apologists who are saying, on the one hand, it's not happening, and on the other hand, color revolutions are good. Nina Jankowicz is one of these people, by the way. People forgot about this.
The Ministry of Truth.
Yeah, she was one of them. She was like a color revolution explainer, and so that's happening, right? There's this official kind of incoherent narrative. It's not happening, but also it's good that it is. And then there's an article in Time Magazine, and the headline is something like the secret shadowy campaign to save the 2020 election. And it's about how these organizations conspired to basically steal the election for Biden, but to fortify the election for Biden. So yeah, I think you're right to notice these parallels. And like Darren Beattie pointed out, like things that appear to come right out of the playbook of color revolutions. So yeah, I mean, this is what the United States does. Unfortunately, the United States government, but which is obviously not the same as the actual American people.
And it's painful to watch because as Americans, but having had this experience, we feel like we're losing this nation to the same things that have taken place around the world. And we really cannot afford to lose the America that we love and that we grew up in. But to go back now to Ukraine, because you have, looking at 2014, and maybe that would be a great example, the Maidan coup of a colored revolution with Victoria Nuland handing out muffins and pretzels. But now she's back. Under the Biden administration. What happened in 2014? Because we seem to be forgetting about it, and now we're only talking about what is taking place now. How did we get to this point?
Well, she's been in, I think, every administration since Clinton except for Trump. I think she was part of the Trump administration very briefly, but then she spent most of the Trump years working at the Center for the New American Security, which is this horrible conflict of interest that's pretending to be a think tank. But no, Nuland she's something else. She's been called the architect of US influence in Ukraine. She's married to arch neoconservative Robert Kagan. Like you said, she was photographed with protesters during the Euromaidan, handing out cookies and stuff like that. This is the woman who infamously, on a phone call talking about the future Ukrainian government, the United States was involved in picking the next Ukrainian government during the Euromaidan, and she famously says, "F the EU" when they're talking about the EU's role in this stuff, which tells you everything you know about her. No, I mean, what to say? I think that the significance of the Ukrainian color revolution is that it was really like the first modern revolution as we understand them today, with like heavy use of social media and civil society organizations, excuse me.
Okay.
And there's a reason why it's called the Facebook revolution, and the journalist uprising is because of the role that technology played in fomenting this thing. Now I wrote a piece on this I wrote two, one for contra.substack.com, my newsletter, and then the other one that takes a really deep dive into the intrigue around those protests it's in Human Events. And I mean, there's so much to get into, but basically all of the indicators show that the US was intimately involved in toppling the administration of Viktor Yanukovych. Now, what triggers this is Yanukovych reneging on basically a kind of trade relation deal with the EU.
Yes.
The reason he reneges on it is because it's basically it's a trade deal, but it's really economic warfare aimed at Russia. And Russia recognizes right away, and Russia goes to Yanukovych and makes him a counteroffer. You'll accept more money in aid and some other things, and basically, kind of like, I mean, there are people say that it would have basically made Ukraine more kind of under the thrall of Russia. I don't know, but the point is that Yanukovych, although today he's portrayed as a kind of Russian puppet, as far as I can tell, he was kind of a neutralist. He was just someone that kind of played both sides. And this is how The Economist described him. He was someone that milked both the EU and Russia. But Russia obviously acted in its interest because it saw that this trade relation between Ukraine and the EU would have destabilized the Russian economy. Like that's arguably what it was designed to do, to use basically Ukraine as a kind of proxy for economic warfare. And so that causes Yanukovych to renege on it. And then that becomes like the flashpoint for this color, the so-called Euromaidan uprising. But the really interesting aspect of this is, again, the role that the US seems to play. I mean, you've got former diplomats, or actually current politicians in places like Poland, saying that the protesters, even perhaps the snipers, were actually trained by the United States. I mean, this is extremely controversial stuff because you remember these shootings, the killings that happened during the protests became kind of like symbolic of the cause of democracy. But then you had an investigation by the EU that actually found that these snipers who killed, I think, about 90 to 100 people, that they were originally this investigation proceeded from the belief that Yanukovych was basically ordering police officers to shoot protesters.
To shoot peaceful protesters, yes.
Right. But what this investigation found was that the snipers who were shooting, on the one hand, they were shooting both police officers and protesters. And on the other hand, that there was a third party that was behind them. This is what an EU investigation found. And the reason no one knows about this is because when this came to light, actually there was one team of shooters and they were shooting both civilians and cops, and they were being told to do this by someone other than Yanukovych. The investigation died. I mean, and the phone call of this conversation got leaked. It was in the Guardian, it was in the BBC, and they just kind of dismissed it as, like, oh, it's the Russians trying to make the EU look bad. But it's incredible that no one thought, like, my God, someone was behind these shootings that was not the Yanukovych regime, as we were told. That whole thing just died. It's incredible because, again, those deaths became symbolic of the Ukrainian cause for democracy.
Yes.
And there's more and more here, but yeah.
And now fast forward to what we're seeing today, and you mentioned at the time, Ukraine was going to be used as an proxy for an economic warfare, but now we are seeing Ukraine, and unfortunately Ukrainian civilians who are bearing the brunt of this being used as proxies against Russia. And it's not only that we're going to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, but we're actually fighting Russia to the last American, because this is directly affecting us here. And people don't seem to make the connection between foreign policy and our economy. And clearly they feel it now, even if they're logically not making it, they simply feel it. But to your point earlier, you said some of these Democrat voters are happy to pay $8 at the gas pump because they're fighting Putin. Is that really what our voters are thinking.
I think unfortunately there's a lot of people who are thinking that. Absolutely. I mean, you can see it everywhere that people are, I mean, you see, I mean, the people that are doing it, see, I apologize for stammering because it's so ridiculous, but I can't help but notice that the people that are doing this the loudest are people with high net worth. They're people with
Yes.
lots of money who are saying that if you think that, high gas prices are more important than what's happening in Ukraine, or that more important than the January 6th committee, then I would ask you to reevaluate, how much you care about democracy. If you're asking me to choose between feeding my family and this thing, this so-called democracy, I'm going to go with feeding my family. I don't know,
100%.
right? I don't know what you mean by democracy. It sounds, when you use that term, it doesn't actually seem to mean democracy. So therefore, I'm going to go with being able to feed my family. If they're basically giving you a choice between democracy and bread.
And I don't think people understand what democracy really means, and it's not a one-size-fit-all kind of concept.
Yeah. And historically, who has won in the contest between democracy and bread? Between the established regime and bread. It's bread.
Absolutely. And we're heading in that direction. Do you see a possibility now, particularly with what is happening? European Union all of a sudden has opened the path for Ukraine and Moldova to join, although there's been other nations, I'd say, candidates for European Union much longer, like Serbia, like some of these countries in South Central Europe who have been consistently opening chapters, but nothing is happening. But particularly with this blockage of Kaliningrad, do you think we are headed into, God forbid, a hot war with Russia, and then we start talking about a nuclear catastrophe?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we're sleepwalking into a hot war with Russia. That's as far as I can tell. It's like no one, I mean, because the alternative is that this is deliberate, right? That our policy objective is actually to get into a hot war with Russia. That's horrifying, and I don't think that's true. And the alternative isn't much better then, because the alternative is that we are, in fact, like there's no one awake at the wheel of this thing.
We're just stumbling into it.
Yes, that's exactly right. That seems to be what I think is happening. And that's what John Mearsheimer has been saying, that the United States is walking into a hot war with Russia with its eyes closed. And I mean, I think it's almost like there could be peace, but the United States government is actively undermining that. I wrote about this too, going back to 2006. There was actually an attempt by the French government and the Russian government, and the French president at the time had a good relationship with the Ukrainian establishment. And there was an attempt to basically create a kind of mutual peace agreement where it would basically involve both Russia and NATO agreeing to be neutral over Ukraine, and Ukraine would just join, the other many countries in Europe that are essentially neutral and not take a side in this. Okay. But when the French, who helped draft this plan, went to the Americans, specifically Condoleezza Rice, and proposed it, like, here is our plan for peace and stability in Europe, the Bush administration threw it out. They actually accused the French of obstructing NATO expansionism, and said, Condoleezza Rice's words were to the effect of, the French have been holding us up in the past, and we're not going to let them do that again. And then two years later, you get the Bucharest summit, where against the objections of Germany and France, the United States forces the NATO summit to, the Bush administration actually wanted to begin the process of formally integrating Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. But because Germany and France said, no, that is a horrible idea, the Bucharest summit settles for basically a affirmation. Someday, Georgia and Ukraine will join NATO. It is inevitable. And that, of course, Russia took as a direct threat to its security. Robert Gates, who served under both the administrations of Bush II and Obama, said that was a monumental overreach. He called it a huge provocation. I mean, again, it really seems like from the beginning, we've either been really confident that Russia will just kind of will allow itself to get pushed over. And when we haven't had that kind of confidence, it's like we're sleepwalking into it. I don't know. I just know that when Democrats say things like, or when the liberal elite say things like the adults are in control in the room, that doesn't seem true to me. So
not at all. And I wonder who in fact is in control, because our unfortunate president falling off of a bicycle doesn't seem to be controlling a whole lot. But just a final question to this point, our experts have been warning that the expansion of NATO could take us overboard, but also Vladimir Putin himself has been telling us for 15 years that this is their red line. And it is something that I have to say, President Trump, with his America First policy, recognized, which is that each nation has a right to their own national interest, including the United States, obviously, but it is America First type national interest, and all other countries subsequently can treat their own national interest in that same way. So why is it so unforgivable in our establishment and in our political landscape, in the discourse, to actually even attempt to have a good relationship with Russia, or even good relationship with China for that matter? And can you pinpoint for me, why do Americans think they hate Russia? Do they even know? Or why we as Americans, but I don't quite fit in that group, I don't hate anybody. Why are Americans conditioned to hate Russia, and do they know what that is?
I think that the animosity towards Russia stems from two things. And one, it's kind of a residual thing from the Cold War that is encouraged for all the wrong reasons by elites. And on the other hand, I think that for liberal internationalists, or I call them liberal interventionists, and it's important to understand that when I say liberal internationalists, I don't just mean Democrats. Like I put people like Dan Crenshaw and John Bolton in this category
100%
of liberal interventionists. Like there's really no difference to me between Dan Crenshaw and Toria,
or former John McCain.
There's no difference. All of these people, regardless of the fact that they're Republicans and Democrats, they all fall under this view of liberal interventionism, that basically the United States has a role, has a responsibility to kind of replicate itself and spread what we call democracy all over the world. The George W. Bush project, right, in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if you believe that, if you buy into this belief, this liberal interventionism, then a country like Russia, it's not just a country, it's like it's a competing ideological project. It's an absolute enemy because it represents something that's alternative and is capable of kind of resisting you. And I think that drives these people insane. And that's why they've kind of had it out for Russia. Is this desire to kind of reconstruct Russia into just another one of its democratic, the process of democratization, which really just means you become a satrap of the US government. And I think it's the fact that Russia has been kind of defiant and has asserted its own right to exist as a superpower that, you know, has national security interests and its own civilization. I think that infuriates ideologues. I think it's really nothing rational, because there is no rational reason that the United States should get into a nuclear war with Russia. You know, after 9/11, Russia allowed us to use air bases firmly within its territory to launch military operations out of basically sympathy to us.
Yes.
It's actually tragic what has happened, that we have come to the brink of nuclear war based entirely over the whims of ideologues who have convinced the American population that this country is their enemy. And I'm not a Russophile. You know, I don't have
not at all.
I don't have a special place in my heart for Russia or anything like that. But you cannot examine what has happened objectively and just come away with any other conclusion that the liberal interventionists in the United States and their allies in the West have made this whole thing inevitable. And the outcome of it is the maximization of human suffering, which they're telling us is necessary to realize their project. You listen to what these people are saying, the liberal interventionists, they're the ones that are going to tell you this right now, your family struggling, you not being able to pay for gas and whatever, like wheat disappearing, things like that, that is the price for the process of democratizing the world. These people are insane, and they're not beholden to reason.
And they're obviously not beholden to the Constitution or to the American people. With that, we are going to end today. Thank you so much for being our guest, and hopefully we will see you again soon.
Thank you so much.